Welcome to the ADM podcast, where we talk property acquisition, development, management, and everything in between. Useful strategies, guidance, and compliance best practices for UK landlords with a sprinkle of personal development along the way. Hope you enjoy, subscribe, and share. Hello, and welcome to today's episode. So, what are we talking about today? We are talking about how to take on your first HMO development. I stipulate first HMO development. Some of this will be useful for landlords and or property investors who have done HMO investments before. It might be useful reflection on sorts of things to consider. Very often when you take on a project for the first time, and it's been the first time for everybody at some point in time, but the first one you take on, there are so much lessons learned. There's so many things that go wrong, and ultimately, for first time landlords, first time investors, hopefully this will be useful kind of challenges just to be aware of and consider. And for those of you that have done it before, like I have, just kind of refresh of the sorts of things you need to be staying on top of. And if you had struggles in the past or lessons learned, it's just to reinforce adjustments that need to be made in that space ultimately. So these are my top four challenges that you need to overcome when working on a HMO development. So it is worth stipulating, I'm making the assumption you've already got the property lined up, you've gone through the acquisition process. That in itself has probably got another four challenges associated to it in terms of research and pricing and acquisition and all that fun stuff. But assuming that's all over the line, and you're looking to kick off. So the first challenge to overcome is the project itself. Now remember, in particular, in this scenario, in particular where we're trying to create a HMO property, all that we need to get the property to in terms of its standard is fully compliant. So we're not going bells and whistles. You may be doing a higher end HMO versus a lower end. Ultimately, in the first instance, make sure your priority is investing in parts of the property to make sure it's compliant. So make sure you've got a good understanding of what the compliance policies and rules are in your area, in the area that the property resides. And it's your objective, your key objective, to be able to hit these standards and slightly exceed in terms of your project in the most cost-effective way. Now, obviously, if you are looking to market to a particular type of tenant, so let's say you are looking to get tenants to only have en suites, then make sure en suites is built into your budget and to your project. If you are looking to go slightly more upmarket, then there are niceties that you can implement. But in the first instance, I always recommend your priority, because with any project prices can slide. And what you don't want to do is have golden taps, but you're not going to have fully compliant fire doors. So, prioritize your fire doors first. And that's the next point, really, to make sure you understand those requirements. So there are fire door specifications, there's emergency lighting standards, there are room size specifications, and how the rooms can be laid out, number of plugs per room, um, size of communal areas, and so on. So ultimately, make sure you take all of that into consideration when structuring and pricing up your project. A major tip that I've was told some time ago, really, and I look to build into my projects, is ultimately, especially in particular for the rooms, um, hand build the furniture. Obviously not you personally, but source someone that can bespokely hand build furniture for the room. Now, you may say that's a lot more expensive route to go, but actually, what it allows you to do is offer a lot more. It almost comes across almost like a hotel kind of bespoke layout and setup specific to the dimensions of the room. But also, what it means is you're ultimately best utilizing the size of that room. So, unless you're fortunate to have a room that's exactly the same size as the showroom in IKEA, then ultimately you're not going to be able to 100% mimic utilizing the same IKEA furniture. You're not going to be able to mimic the dimensions of that room. So you can either be left with areas of the room that can't be used properly, or furniture that doesn't fit quite right, and so on and so forth. So definitely bespokely creating and getting um, carpenter to build your furniture, maybe even beds, for example, that can build into the wall and so on. The more bespoke you can be, again, in a cost-effective way, still following the minimum requirements in terms of sizes and so on, the better. And bear in mind, you're not just hiring the carpenter for one room. You may use them for 4, 5, 6 different bedrooms. So from a cost effectiveness, you can generally get much better prices if you're offering a lot more work to them. So the final time with tip, in terms of the scope of the project itself. So, number one, make sure you're staying compliant. Number two, utilize bespoke kind of furniture whilst still meeting your requirements, is to potentially utilize an architect. Now, again, it may sound like I'm just throwing additional costs and overheads at you, um, but having a good architect and or quantity surveyor can really help you, one, stay on top of your design, and two, stay on top of your budget. At the bare minimum, I would definitely recommend hiring a competent project manager. So, they may be coming with the building company that you're hiring to go and do the project itself, but trying to do the project management yourself, more than anything, unless it's your expertise, unless you're adding value in that space, and unless you're super competent, ultimately it's more likely you're going to make mistakes than you don't. Um, and when you're having to stay on top of tradespeople, it can very much feel like it's having to be a teacher in control of a very, very naughty, is the kindest way to say it, set of children in a room, because you've got the electrician blaming the plasterer blaming the plumber, and the plumber blaming the decorator. So it's a bit of a vicious circle, and ultimately each of these different stakeholders only care about their remit, only care about their kind of responsibility when you're bringing them onto the project. So if you want to avoid super expensive mistakes ultimately, and things that can kick your project down the road in terms of timelines, definitely get a project manager. And if you can afford to, make sure you have a good architect and good architectural designs at the forefront, and a quantity surveyor who can oversee the project throughout in terms of the costings as well. So number two, the second kind of challenge to overcome, in terms of your HMO development, your investment, if you like, is the mortgage. So obviously, if you are a cash buyer, and if you are, good luck to you. I'm not here to give investment advice, but generally, um, I would say leveraging on property investments is a better route to go. But again, no investment advice there. But for the most of us, we will be leveraging some sort of debt function capability from a mortgage provider. So mortgages are slightly different for HMOs, and it is worth being kind of across that detail. So interestingly, regardless of and this is probably more apparent a few years ago when HMOs and Article 4 grandfather rights and all that fun stuff was less kind of apparent. But even and it's more that's more something that does exist in across all councils now in terms of their HMO policy. But back in the day, even when you could have a 4-bedroom house and you didn't require a HMO license, interestingly, the actual policy of mortgage companies still wanted to know information around the volume of rooms, and they would actually treat a property as a HMO, even if the local council didn't. So it's worth being across that. Your mortgage provider, what are their policies in terms of and requirements? Because they may have bespoke requirements in terms of the type of insurance you need to have, and all that fun stuff. So what are their policies? They're going to be more demanding on you. Ultimately, is the thing to be aware of. Um, the next part is ultimately how much it's going to cost. So, a vanilla buy to let is going to be cheaper than a HMO mortgage, and this is primarily because of the risk associated. Um, from the mortgage lender's perspective. So why is it a higher risk if you can generate more money, which is generally generate higher revenues? Ultimately, the mortgage companies look at a couple of ways. One of the key things is the more bespoke you have to modify a property to kind of be set up as a HMO. Obviously, you've got fire doors, you've got emergency lighting, um, and you've bespokely created it so you can fit 4 fridges in the kitchen. That's quite a niche ultimately, and as much as there are lots of investors that want to own HMOs, there are a hell of a lot more that want to own family homes. So if you've created a super bespoke and niche HMO property, it's going to be more difficult to sell, is in the eyes of the mortgage companies, in the eyes of their kind of in terms of their compliance and policy. Sorry, not the compliance, but in terms of their policy and kind of risk appetite, that's how they see it. So what you need to kind of be aware of is that's why they're going to charge you higher interest rates, and also higher fees. So yeah, make sure you're across that and build that into your budget. And then the final thing to be really across is that generally the volume of mortgage providers is far less. So not only is their policy more strict, not only are their fees higher, but actually the availability of lenders is far less. So definitely, I recommend getting a good broker who can get you access to the best deals on the market. I mean, I've been fortunate enough now to have a long relationship with my current mortgage provider, and I've got a few properties with them, the same provider. However, um, now you can't actually build a relationship with them directly. You have to go via an intermediary or broker. Um, and even for remortgages, I have to do that. But in particular, for any new applications, any new mortgages, you have to go via a broker to get some of these access to some of these deals. So, yeah, definitely make sure that is taken into consideration when sorting out your mortgage. Number three on my list is the council. So, depending on the area, there are different definitions as to what qualifies as a HMO, and ultimately what type of HMO they qualify it as. So, in some areas, four areas, you actually need planning permission. In some areas, HMOs don't really trigger until you've got 4 or 5 separate households. Um, and back in the day, that was the case. I think most councils now have got relatively aligned policies around HMOs. But I remember, the area that I grew up in around London, their HMO policy triggered two more than two households in a single property. So yeah, get to know the council, get to know their requirements. The information is readily available on their website. So if you just have a quick Google of the local council, and just search their licensing section. So ultimately, to bear in mind, like licensing is the rules and regulations around how the property is set up and how it operates as an accepted HMO. The planning is more around the permission for it to operate as a HMO. And ultimately, the reason why um, the planning part is needed there is generally in areas where either the council doesn't want HMOs to be operating, or there'll be too much of a burden, and that could be like an aesthetic thing. Or I always sense it's like I was like a kind of a snobbery behind having shared house accommodations. Um, but also there is the logistical piece, which is if you have 10 HMOs lined up on a single road, that's a much greater demand in terms of um, the council's demands in terms of the rubbish collection, in terms of the volume of people in the area and the amenities that they require and all this fun stuff. So this is ultimately why some councils put restrictions around that, and kind of mandate the planning permission piece because again they know that the properties are going to be set up and run in a slightly different way, and in today's times ultimately there is a shortage on readily available properties for families. So councils don't want these sorts of your go-to popular family houses, which I say are 2 to 4 bedroom properties. They don't want all of those being purchased and used for HMO, the perceived greedy landlords, which none of us are. We are good, compliant landlords that try to do the best for our tenants. But nevertheless, we don't always have the best reputation, unfortunately. So, so yeah, so get to know the council's requirements. I personally try to have a good relationship with the local licensing team, because they can pick up the phone. You can pick up the phone with them or send them an email and have if you have certain inquiries around things that you may need to do, especially at the start of a project, things to take into consideration, particularly around room sizes. I think is a useful thing to talk to them about. And if there's not something off the shelf that they can just send you as a PDF, then yeah, pick up the phone and ask them via email. Why not? Okay, fourth and final challenge to overcome is the tenant. So the tenant dynamic is, I think, super important. What do tenants require in that area? Because ultimately that should define how you set up, cater, and market to tenants. So, is it a cheap working class accommodation they're looking for? Is it seasonal student lets? Is it somewhere that's particularly good in terms of transport and parking options? Is it a professional household that needs super fast internet because they're all going to be working remotely? Or you know, understand what sort of tenant not only you're going to target, because you can try and target whichever type of tenant you want, but like what sort of tenants are actually going to be operating and looking for shared accommodation in that area. So in terms of the competition, is there an abundance of HMOs already in that area? Sometimes that's a good sign and sometimes it's not. For example, if you find a 3 bedroom house or 4 bedroom house or whatever, that you're able to convert into a HMO, but it's in a super family friendly area that doesn't have great transport links because everyone's got a car and a drive, and um, ultimately there's nothing in that area in terms of work. It's just surrounded by greenery and schools, because it is a family focused kind of rural area. Um, then that may not work. And the fact that there's no other HMOs in that area is probably a sign that the demand for shared rooms in that area is not that high. On the flip side, if you've got an area that has got a plethora, like almost every other house, councils maybe not been on top of it as much as they should have, maybe every other house is operating as a HMO, and you'll see this more likely in the student areas. That level of competition can be very difficult, and ultimately it can sometimes become a quick race to the bottom in terms of who prices the lower level. So that, which obviously can hurt your profitability. So yeah, get to understand your area, your competition. And websites such as spareroom.com are a good place to do this sort of research. So that's us, guys. So hopefully that's been useful. In particular, if you're taking on your first HMO development, there's some pieces of information in there I wish I would have been able to tell myself 10 years ago. That's for sure. When I took on my first property, in particular around setting up of the room, um, and the structure of the internals of the house. And I think when you're taking on a house that you're taking back to brick and you can create bespoke to your needs, that's far more effective than if you're taking on a property that you're not converting or doing much refurbishment to. Because once tenants are in those rooms, it's even if only one tenant is still in the house and you've got the other three rooms empty, it is very difficult to go in there and throw builders and throw tradespeople in there to do work without disrupting the existing tenants. And moreover, once you're kind of putting your builders and your tradesmen in there, that's obviously giving you a cost in terms of the lack of income and revenue from potential tenants. So yeah, do the research up front. Make sure you scope in the compliance and the functionality side of your rooms. Use bespoke carpenters that can create bespoke furniture and layout for you. Make sure you're on top of your mortgage details and make sure the prices work for you. Make sure you're understanding the requirements that the council has and whether you'll need planning permission, what sort of license you need, and the costs associated to that. And finally, do your research on the potential tenants and who best you want to market to. So, as always, guys, really appreciate you listening. Really appreciate if you can hit a like and subscribe, leave a review, follow us on the social medias. Yeah, stay in touch.